last class we talked about the evolutionary perspective of animals, and we're going to start talking about the ecological part of the animal kingdom. When we're talking about biodiversity, we're specifically talking about the populations and their interactions with each other. If we remember back, the populations is just a group of one species. A community is all the populations, and then the ecosystem is something we really focus on right now, and that's going to be all the living and non-living things and how they interact. When we actually talk about biodiversity, it's just the sum total of genetically based variety of all organisms in the biosphere. That's the technical definition. Biodiversity is just how diverse all the living things are. Now when we talk about ecosystem diversity, this is going to not only just include the populations and the communities, but it also includes their habitats, because you include the non-living and the processes in the living world, such as the water cycle, the carbon cycle. Okay, all of that is going to affect living organisms in different ways. Now you also have species diversity. Now you're getting down smaller. Species is just one type of animal. So when we talk about the diversity, it's the number of different species in this biosphere, which we've talked about that right now there's only about 10% of the species that have ever lived. And then genetic, we're focusing more on the DNA. Genetic diversity is the sum total of all the different forms of genetic information carried by all organisms living on Earth. So when we're talking about that, we're really focusing on the diversity of our DNA and our genetic information. So you can break down diversity in many different levels, more broad, and then when you get to the species, it's just broken down into that individual species. Now, when we're talking about biodiversity, you kind of wonder why it's important. Biodiversity, it's one of the greatest natural resources. If you think about what different species provide us with, different animals have provided us with foods, industrial products that we use, medicines, including painkillers, antibiotics. All of those different drugs have came from different species. A lot of different species in the rainforest do provide us with a lot of different medicines. So we have to continue to increase our biodiversity so we can continue using that. Now, threats to biodiversity. Human activity is the biggest one. Humans are always altering habitats, which is going to affect different organisms. Humans hunt, and some species to extinction. When we talk about fertilizers, humans are introducing these toxic compounds into food, and not only do you, like when you're spraying a plant with a toxic compound, it's going to spread to the things that are eating those plants and so on. So that's when it says the food web, it's not just one species that it's affecting. Then the last one we're going to talk about is introducing foreign species to new environments. We're really going to focus on invasive species and endangered species today. And that's what your assignment's going to be over. And invasive are these foreign species that hurt an ecosystem because there's no natural predators, and they grow exponentially. Extinction occurs when a species completely disappears from that part, from either the range or all together. We're going to focus more on endangered species, and those are the species that are declining in a way that makes it in danger of extinction. A lot of them, they are caused by humans most of the time. One is habitat alteration, and this is when they start to develop land and natural habitats are destroyed. What a lot of times this does, it's what's called habitat fragmentation, and it's going to split the ecosystem so that range that we were talking about, they can split it up into pieces, and the smaller species is going, or the smaller habitat is going to be which one is affected more because it doesn't have as many resources available to it. So very often those species will suffer. Not only have species been pushed to extinction because of habitat loss, they've also been pushed to extinction because of hunting. A lot of times the U.S. has said that you cannot hunt endangered species to protect them from going into extinction. Another way we threaten our different biodiversity in different species is because of pollution. An example of this is they used to use what was called DDT in some of the first pesticides. So they were using it to keep some of the organisms off plants so they didn't kill them. The problem was people weren't seeing the direct effect. They considered it harmless at first, but the problem was it was going into streams and it can't be broken down. So therefore it was picked up by organisms and it couldn't be eliminated through their bodies. So like I talked about earlier, now that's going to affect the entire food web because whatever consumes that organism is also going to consume that DDT. In this case, when the DDT entered the food web, it went through what's called biological magnification, and the concentration of this harmful substance increases as the higher trophic level, as you increase. Here is an example of magnification with the DDT. So it goes into the water at relatively low concentrations, but as it goes up the food web, so as it goes to the producers, the concentration has increased because it's a smaller area. So those would be like your algae and things like that. And then your first level consumers, your zooplankton, the concentration just continues to increase till you get to these small fish, and then the even larger fish, until finally you get to the larger birds, and they have such a high concentration of that DDT, it was causing those large birds to become endangered. In the 70s, DDT was banned, and most industrial other countries did, and this has caused the bird populations to recover. Now, on the other aspect of this, you also have species that are introduced into an ecosystem and will hurt the biodiversity. So another threat to biodiversity comes from plants and animals that humans transport, either accidentally or intentionally. These are called invasive species. So the definition of an invasive species, they are introduced species that reproduce rapidly because of their new habitat lacks predators. Predators help control population. So if you have an invasive species that does not have any predators, once again, they will also grow exponentially. One example of an invasive species are zebra mussels. They were transported into the Great Lakes, and they didn't have any predators, and they grew exponentially and caused ecological problems in the United States. About any species could be an invasive species if it's taken to a place where it has no predators. In Florida, they are having large snakes that used to be people's pets, and they are released. And now these snakes are causing problems because there's no predators for them, and they are growing too big. When we talk about conservation, this is just the management of natural resources, including the preserving habitats so it doesn't cause animals to go endangered or extinct. So last thing, like I just said, the conservation efforts, the job there is to hopefully that we keep species around and we don't cause them to go extinct or even endangered.